Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to another episode of Reading the Room, a podcast in which I talk about something bookish with a bookish guest. And today I am very, very excited to have my first author discussion interview with Julia May Jonas, author of Vladimir, which is out when you're watching this today, February 1st. And so thank you, Julia, so much for coming on the podcast. I adored this book. It is such a fun and brainy romp of a novel. And I think all of you watching will really enjoy this. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me.
It's truly one of the most exciting debut novels I've read in a while. It's kind of shocking to me that this is a debut just from how masterful it is. I find in craft and just critical analysis of the novel as well. It's just so brilliant. So yeah, I have a bunch of questions for you today. But before I get into that, a link to purchase this will be in the description below. I linked to bookshop.org as it supports indie bookstores, but you can also purchase it wherever you tend to buy books as well. So to get into it, can you give an overview of what Vladimir is all about? There's a lot going on in this book, so I'm curious to know how you summarize it.
I usually summarize it by saying that it's about a 58-year-old female professor who, when the novel opens, her husband, who's also a professor at the same college, is being investigated for past inappropriate relationships with students. And into that scene walks Vladimir Vladinsky, who is this experimental, celebrated 40-year-old novelist with a family of his own who's starting at the college, and the narrator becomes obsessed with him, and this obsession takes her down a path of extreme actions and pretty disastrous results.
Absolutely. This book, I won't get into any spoilers, of course, but it really, really surprised me by the end of it. I did not see that all coming. So I think many will be surprised by where this book goes in a really interesting way. And I know you have an MFA in playwriting from Columbia University. And so I'm just wondering, did the idea for Vladimir begin as a play, or did you always know that it was going to be a novel or intend for it to be a novel?
That's interesting. Yes, I started thinking about the idea of writing a play about the wives or a wife of a man caught in a Me Too-like scandal in 2018. And so I did write a play, and it was very, very different from Vladimir. The main character was only one character inside of the whole play. It was kind of more of a riff on desire and taboo, and trying to figure out how we want what we want. And so that I got to about page 70 with it, and I realized that it wasn't actually working. And so I put it away and didn't really think about it, or kept thinking about it, but couldn't move forward with it. And then when the pandemic happened, I thought, maybe that one character I can do something with her. I think I can. And so then I wrote the first chapter in her voice, and I felt like I showed it to my husband actually and said, "Do you think I could do something with this?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Okay,
Nice.
All right, I'm going to continue."
Yeah, and so just kind of touching on the intro, it is a really striking intro, I would say, and it's interesting. So I won't say kind of what happens later, but the intro scene kind of sets up something that happens later in the novel. And was that always intentional, or did you kind of realize that you were jumping around in time a little bit in that front?
Well, I think where I had stopped in the play is I had gotten to the scene that she foreshadows in that prologue. And then I didn't know where to go from there. So I knew there was something about writing her in prose. I knew that I could kind of work it out once I got there. So I had the idea of what was going to happen, that moment that she alludes to. And I didn't know exactly how I was going to get there. And that's kind of how the prologue came together.
And so one of my favorite aspects of Vladimir is its preoccupation with the novel itself. I thought all those examinations were so interesting in the telling of this really, intriguing novel also. And so the narrator, as you mentioned, she's a professor and a novelist. And in her reflections on her teaching, she considers how her students approach critically thinking about novels. And so there's one section in which she talks about the novel Rebecca and how her students explore it, and how she tends to find that her students only critique the representations that are contained within the novels and the characters rather than the actual formal elements such as symbolism, repetition, etc. And so how did this examination of the form of the novel versus the representations within it inform your approach to writing Vladimir?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to do something with me being a playwright in that I am very, very interested in form. In a way, in plays, form is kind of the main container. You can't really write a play without thinking about the form in a certain way. And so I am always, or I can't. I mean, I think some people can. So I am just very consumed with formally the way things are put together. That's always been where I found my pleasure in books,
Mhm.
and in literature, is thinking about construction. So I very much wanted to think about this novel as you said, being both interested in talking about, like, how do we talk about form more in everything that we approach, because form is also inextricably linked with content. But also I think we take for granted how much it informs how we take in something. So yes, I was very interested in thinking about what form the novel was going to take and playing with the form. I mean, as you know from how the book is, um, it in a way it almost shifts forms, um, throughout it.
Absolutely.
And I've always been interested in plays and in certain books that kind of shift form and ask you to look at something in a different way as a result of that.
Yeah, I think that's something that's so exciting about this book for me is because I'm also reading this book right now called How to Read Literature. So it's a book of literary criticism that in the opening section of the book, it's by Terry Eagleton, and he talks about how like he like sets up the scene of students talking about Wuthering Heights and about like talking about whether they like Heathcliff as a character or not, rather than actually, examining what
Mhm.
she's doing with the novelistic form. And so I love anytime a book like even just touches on kind of like what's going on structurally. I find it so interesting, and I tend like in reviews online, I love when reviews kind of touch on that aside from just what the book is like on the surface level discussing. I think that's really interesting. So I love that about this book.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
so,
I'm a professor, so I mean, I'm a teacher of theater and playwriting, and my main thing that I talk to my students about is always getting away from like or dislike and getting into, like, what's happening, how's it working, how can we use it, how can we look at it, what do we think is they're doing. That, to me, that's just always the more interesting conversation.
yeah, absolutely, because this book does get into some sticky topics. As you mentioned, her husband, the narrator's husband, has been alleged to have, been involved in sexual misconduct with the students. And so, what I found really interesting, and I kind of my eyes opened when I read it, was that she tends to shift the blame towards the students and implicating them in their, autonomy to engage in sexual relationships with her husband. And so, I wanted to know how you went about crafting that and talking about a very sticky topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was really interested in someone who is, from her generation and her particular perspective. And I'm not as old as the narrator of my novel, but even for me, the way that student-teacher relationships were allowed when I went to college was very, very different. Now, I'm not saying it's not right, or rather, I'm not saying it's right. But you do swim in the waters that you swim in, and it can be really hard to break out of that perspective. And so I think for me, I was really interested in looking at this woman who was really interested in breaking out, who was trapped in a perspective, trapped in a way inside of her time period. Um, and it's a, in that way, it's a diagnosis of who this character might be, not a prescription for how we should view these things. I feel like something that she's really interested in and is really important to her, because it really is important to women of an older generation, is just being able to be sexually free, because virginity was so policed, at a certain point. And that can lead to a number of things, including, you know, the kind of, what's happening right now with Roe versus Wade. That is about thinking about this idea of sex as a damaging thing that women, if they're being morally interested, should avoid. And so I think her, she's locked in that, and it can be really hard to then shift that and say give a new shade or a new nuance. And I think she's in process with it, but that's where she starts the book coming from.
Yeah. And so that kind of informs my reading of the novel, is that it's the narrator's attempt to try to understand herself, I found, through like four key relationships. So one is with her husband,
Mhm.
two is with her daughter, three, her students, and then lastly, Vladimir also. And
Mhm.
so what I found really interesting was like when she was talking to Vladimir about his novel at one point in the book, she like gives her critical thoughts about it to him. And she talks about how she liked his use of like shifting tenses to get at this question of like self-delusion and whether we can really understand ourselves. And
Mm-hmm.
I felt this was incredibly perceptive to understanding her as a narrator also. But I
Mm-hmm.
also found that she does tend to deceive herself as well. So while she's this very perceptive and intelligent woman, through the narration of the book, you can also tell that she's kind of deceiving herself as well through her understanding of what's going on with Vladimir and with her husband and all of this. So was this something, I'm always curious, did you discover these kind of examinations as you were writing, or were these kind of intentional at the outset of like you wanted to explore this question of self-deception through this lens?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm always pretty interested in the filters we put upon our experience, whether we are conscious or unconscious about those filters, and the way that those can intercept really a true clear seeing. So I think, so I'm always interested in characters who aren't seeing completely clearly. And I think everyone inside of the book is not seeing completely clearly. I think they're all putting assignations and assumptions and their own personal experiences are all putting blinders on their perspectives and that's affecting how they interact with each other.
Yeah. And it really lends itself to a quite suspenseful book because I didn't really know, like, as I was reading this, I wasn't sure how unreliable our narrator was. Like, I didn't know, like, was she completely making up what she was thinking about Vladimir? I won't say what happens, but you just don't really know. And so I really found that was so intriguing as you're reading to understand what's really going on with this book. And again, with form, it gets very exciting and surprising. So, so one of my favorite passages from the novel is when the narrator, her husband, and Vladimir are sitting by the pool and they're talking about the current state of autofiction. So this is something like with my friends online, I've been talking a ton about autofiction and we love like the current contemporary autofiction novels like Rachel Cusk, Sheila Heti, Lauren Euler. We're very interested in this question of autofiction and the kind of critical examination of it. So to briefly summarize, the narrator thinks that their students in creative writing are writing these books because they're so obsessed with themselves that they can't imagine themselves existing outside of their own viewpoint. And then her husband says he thinks that it comes from an anxiety about representing identities other than their own. And then Vladimir, he says that he thinks it's because they've grown up online, representing themselves via avatars, building brands and presences and constructions of selves before they even know what they were doing. And I laughed out loud when I read the section because I thought it was so interesting because I think they all have a good point. And I just want to know what you think about autofiction aside from, what your characters say in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, I think that I love all of those books that you mentioned as well, and I would add, Garth Greenwell to that list and
Yeah.
Ben Lerner and I think all of those it's some of the most exciting writing that is happening, So I don't know. At a certain point, I'm like, well, it works. It's okay because it works. It's great.
Yeah.
It's teaching us something about who we are right now. So in a way, the question of what the form is irrelevant to the fact that it feels vivid and it feels central to our moment right now and it's speaking to us, so there's something that's happening with it that I think is good. And then, yeah, I mean, I think that was a little bit of a chance to explore all the generous and ungenerous perspectives that exist around autofiction. I mean, I remember I went and saw He Wrote a Boy's Life, and I'm always kind of mess up his name. I think it's Edmund Wilson, but it could be Edward. I may have the name wrong. He made this point that when he was writing, he, that the only autobiographies that came out were about astronauts or presidents. Those were the only people who were allowed to write autobiographies. So he wrote a novel called A Boy's Life, but he said, this is a memoir. This was a memoir. I just couldn't say it was. So I characterized it as a novel.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think you can necessarily, I think it's kind of a dangerous territory to say that certain novels were the person they were writing about. But I think the form has just existed actually for a really long time. And we've gotten more specific about labeling the form, I think, in a certain way. For me, I just always feel like if the writing is exciting and good and I feel interested in the form, I have I certainly don't have any sort of moral objection to it. I do think there's an anxiety, I think, in writers who are starting out about attempting stories. So I think she's really attacking it from the sense of being an educator and working with these people who are telling stories, and they feeling an anxiety to get outside of their comfort zones versus people who are working in, writing in such high levels in the form.
Absolutely. And I know this question of like autofiction too, in my mind, plays with this question of like also authors having an online persona. And that's something I'm really interested in. And so just a quick question on kind of like your place as an online, writer and publishing your debut novel. How does that like feel having like, easy access to like readers or them having access to you via like comments or DMs? And like, how does that, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, if you have any?
I mean, we're having a nice conversation right now, so this is very positive, and we found each other in social media, so I think that's good. But on the whole, it makes me a nervous wreck, absolutely. And when I read biographies about writers writing books in the past, and, they got a newspaper, once a day, and then something would have some news about their book, and they would read it, and then they would have to go on with their day because there were no more newspapers. There was nothing more coming in, or they got the mail, or they got a phone call. It does feel like it just requires an intense amount of self-regulation, as for myself, that I have to be extremely, extremely disciplined about not looking at reactions, not checking for reactions, because it's also like that kind of thing can either make your day or ruin it. And even if it kind of makes your day, then it can also just render you useless for the rest of the day. I've had the worst days after I've gotten the best news, because I can't keep my head on straight. I can't just do what I'm doing. And so I think it's in general, I think it's good for conversation. And I think it's hard just from a personal self-regulation point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I often wonder, like some of my favorite writers, I tend to like after I read a book, I just go to YouTube and I look up their name and see if just watching interviews about it. And I feel like it's really interesting, this question of like letting the book stand on its own versus also picking into the brain of the author and their ideas for it. And I just find that an interesting, I don't really know what my thoughts are on it still, but I think it's just an interesting habit that readers like myself tend to have of like wanting to get behind the book and like know more about how it was crafted. But I think it's a natural inclination as well.
Yeah, I mean, and I think when it can go in depth is when it feels the most satisfying. I mean, I think listening to an interview with an author on YouTube can be satisfying because they're given a span of time to talk about their work. I think it's more of the kind of social media responding to, in that inside of that frame where you're responding with a sentence or you're posting a sentence about something. I think that is where I think it can feel tricky and hard, because you also want to be appreciative to people who have read the book, because I feel extremely appreciative to anyone who's taken the time to read the book. And I just don't want to be in a, kind of cycle with myself where I look all the time, because that just feels very dangerous.
Gotcha. Yeah. So let's get a little bit into the meat of the plot, I guess. So the title, Vladimir, seems to be a clear nod to Nabokov, but maybe that's what I got from it, at least. So was he an inspiration for this book, and was Vladimir always the title in your mind for it?
Vladimir was always the title. And I think it was a bit of a game with myself. I didn't know if I was going to keep the title of Vladimir the whole time. It was slightly a whim, but certainly, of course, you can't look at the whole plot of my book and not see how there are resonances with certain Nabokov books. And even, in a way, less Lolita than one of his earlier books. Laughter at the Dark is something that I thought a lot about when I was writing this book. That's a book I really, really love and have read several times. My husband, again, was reminding me the other day that when I started writing the play, I was actually reading a biography of Vera Nabokov. And so I think I had been thinking quite a bit about her as being such a close collaborator with him, and also someone who took care of him domestically, took care of him physically, and made his work her life's passion. You know, she wrote his lectures for him. And I think there was just that little spark of inspiration. So, you know, this book is not at all about Vera Nabokov or based on her life or anything like that, but it was that spark of inspiration about the way both she did react to when Nabokov had any sort of criticism thrown upon him about how he wrote about young women, but also his relationships with young women, which he didn't really have that, you know, it was certainly not in any formal way, and how she might feel. I think it was this idea of how she might feel in this circumstance, being who she was and being as accomplished as she was, and how she might interpret it. Because I think you're right. I think I had an idea that she might interpret it through form in a way, as a story, because that's how she sees her life. And that was a whole bunch of assumptions about Vera Nabokov, who I am not qualified to actually say anything about, actually knowing anything about. But that was the inspiration. I think that was the spark.
That's so interesting. I want to read, I actually haven't read his work before. I just know about him, you know, as most do. I really want to read his work this year. That's actually a goal of mine. After I read this, I was like, I really want to dive into his text, because I feel like it informs so many of the books that I currently read. I mean, it's a huge influence. So yeah, I'll have to make that a priority this year.
Yeah. Yeah. I think he's definitely worthwhile to read. And he's, you know, such a brilliant prose writer to begin with, but also has just this very keen sense of dramatic irony. And I loved, he also, you know, I remember reading the story about the fact that he wrote Lolita to be a hit. He really wanted a hit. He had books that had done pretty well. He had a good job at Cornell, but he really wanted to write a hit. And that was part of what went into writing Lolita at the time. And so I think when I was thinking about her finding this new zhuzh with her own writing, it was about you know, thinking about what happens when you start to have that inspiration going, and you think like, okay, yeah, this is a book that I can really give to the world that I think they're going to respond to.
The narrator's obsession with Vladimir is, I found, incredibly nuanced. I found myself wondering throughout the book, like what her obsession was truly rooted in, despite from like what she's kind of telling to the reader in her narration. I questioned whether it was like a form of self-deception as a response to her husband's affairs, or whether it was like a longing for the potential that Vladimir has as a younger novelist. She's had 2 novels published, and one of them wasn't received as well as her first book. And so can you talk about how you like framed the narrative in her longing and obsession for Vladimir as like the driving force of the novel? At least that's what I found.
Yeah, I mean, I think a big question I had while writing it was this question about female ages. How much are they allowed to desire? So that's an obvious question that's put inside of the book the whole way through. And I think when it came to Vladimir, I feel like she, exactly as you say, desires kind of all aspects of him. She desires, you know, she has thoughts about desiring him physically, but I agree with you that I think those are really less potent than she wants to be him. She wants to be where he is, you know, starting out with all that potential, you know, being celebrated, feeling confident. He embodies this sense of having everything she doesn't have, I think, or she feels like she doesn't have at this moment, including, you know, time to start again, time to make a life in a certain kind of way. So I think he very much is I think her desire is much more about wanting what he has and wanting to be who he is than about, you know, possessing him.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because I find that when we are introduced to Vladimir, he seems like this very, for lack of a better word, like put together character. He seems to have everything going for him. He seems very like, you know, he's beautiful. He's constructed in a sense like a perfect light. But then as we learn more about himself and his marriage to a memoirist, we learn a little bit more about, I guess, more dicey past that I guess he has. And a little bit as we get into the later half of the novel, more of his own perceptions of himself in relation to our narrator, which I found really interesting to kind of see the power imbalance there play out as they kind of get closer to each other by the end of the book, which was really interesting. And so I know this book is also really about motherhood, I found too. And so the narrator has a daughter who is a lawyer, and she's in a queer relationship. And I would say that her relationship with her daughter seems to be the least messy of all of them in the book. And so I just want to know how you kind of approached writing about motherhood in this mother-daughter relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't It wasn't, in the case of the mother-daughter relationship, it wasn't as formal as a choice. I didn't think about balancing the scales for the narrator in some way. But I did find that as I wrote her relationship, and I think it's important that it's her daughter, that it's someone that she wants to make sure has a different life than she does in a certain way, and different conceptions, and she wants to help in a way that I think she never really was helped. Because of that, she has a real generosity towards her daughter, and that she doesn't necessarily have when it comes to the rest of the world. I think it's her project. In a way, I feel like, I mean, I think for many people, parenthood becomes a form of religion because they don't have their own religion. And
Hmm.
I think for her, I think the way that she parents her Sid is in a way for her chance to be good, her chance to be humble, her chance to serve. And that's how she manifests that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting dichotomy in her character because we get so many like different lenses to see her through, particularly because I know like many readers, like I mentioned earlier, in her perception, I guess, of her husband's affairs with the students, like I think she's just very nuanced and balanced in the way that you kind of portray her, which I found really interesting. And I loved like that she's not just, black and white reading of her, which I thought was interesting. And I think the motherhood aspect of this book really helped explore those things as well. So yeah, I just love those sections of the book too. It brings some like warmth as well, and like in some of the scene setting that you do.
And I wanted to explore, I mean, going off of what you were saying, I wanted to explore her perspective. I mean, until she takes action, she's not really doing anything. She's thinking about all these things. Of course we're rageful, vengeful monsters in our minds sometimes. But she's outwardly attempting to act in a way that is acceptable until of course, like, something flips.
Yeah. So, kind of veering to another point, but I just wanted to touch on the book cover because I think it's
Mhm.
incredible. And I watched your publisher, they put out this really cool video about, I think it was like 9 or 10 different options that were pitched as like the cover of this book. And so I'll link that below for anyone that's interested. I'm really interested in book covers generally. And so, do you often pick up books like based on their cover alone, or like what's your relationship to book covers and this one, if you have anything to mention about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I am certainly attracted to certain books because of their book covers, and I think I will pick them up, or I'll turn them over, read the back, and then pick them up as a result. It's such an audacious cover, and I'm so excited that they went with that idea, and this idea of really, really picking up on the idea of a female gaze, and a woman looking at a man as an object of lust. And also I feel like I love the font of there's something so witty about the way the whole cover is put together that I feel like, what one thing I said to my publisher is it could be picked up for the wrong reasons and it could be picked up for the right reasons, and both would be good with me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. When I opened, so I got this proof sent to me, and when I opened it, I was like, I remember like holding it back, like, what is this? And then I read the synopsis, and I was like, this sounds amazing. And I just think it so well represents what's contained in the book that I don't know. I think it's just perfect. One of like the best, most stunning book covers I've seen in quite a while. So I think they nailed it with this. I love it. Yeah, this
Yeah, I
font, like
like
you
it.
mentioned, it's
I like
stunning.
it. Yeah. I think for some people they find it a little too hot. But I think it's just right for the book because I think the book is about kind of making you sit, like, squirm a little bit.
Oh yeah, big time. It will definitely make you squirm, especially that third act. I wish we could go into spoilers, but I won't. I'll let everyone be surprised. And so another question, I know we talked about playwriting, but I'm wondering how theater informed Vladimir, particularly like, again, I won't spoil it, but in the climax of the book, I found that like the scene setting and just how it's constructed was so interesting, and it kind of reminded me of like of building up to that climax of like watching a play and seeing it all the pieces come together. Did that like play as a potential like inspiration for your crafting of the climax?
Yeah, I mean, I think it played into an idea of the way I would, construct anticipation for the next scene from chapter to chapter. I think I would think about something similarly. And I say anticipation, not suspense. It's not necessarily about what's going to happen, but instead a kind of curiosity that will make you leap into the next scene. So I definitely did think about that. And I think naturally, maybe just through osmosis or absorption from thinking about Aristotle and the Poetics, that I can look at, Vladimir now and see how it does in a way follow those rules. So I think all of those went together, and I think just a sense of also the brevity of telling the story. Plays have to be kind of uber economical because it's really not a lot of writing in place. Not a lot, not a big word count, so you have to be so economical. And so I did think about that, or in a way not think about that, but that was going to be the way I was going to tell the story. I'm not accustomed to sitting and luxuriating in scenes for long amounts of time. In a way, the kind of liberation actually of writing the novel was I was pushing forward, but I could take the time to go and spend 2 pages on backstory, or 2 pages on a really vivid memory that she's having. And that felt just like so pleasurable because you have to kind of make that all understood inside of a play without actually ever being explicit about it.
And I guess similarly, are there any like other novels, I guess, do you find are in conversation with your book, or like contemporary or older texts? Do you have any of those?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to mention The Sea by Iris Murdoch, but also many of her other books. Particularly, I thought a lot about The Sea. It's a book I've read several times. There's a very interesting transparency of voice that's happening throughout the entire book. And there's basically this thing that happens in Vladimir, which is the book starts in a place of psychological realism. And then the character who we're kind of, we kind of think he's maybe not the greatest, but we're along the ride with him, does something very, very, very extreme. And then a bunch of extreme things happen after that. And I think Iris Murdoch was really interested in the potential of humans to cross a threshold, to cross a moral threshold. We all kind of maybe play. We had, there are these fantasies about doing things intrusive. In psychological terms, we could call them intrusive thoughts. We could categorize them in any number of ways, but we all have, a kind of fantasy life that imagines maybe doing something unspeakable or rash or entirely out of character, but we never do it. And I think she was really interested in looking at characters who did kind of make that leap. And that's what she does in The Sea. She makes that leap. And so I was similarly interested in being inside a character, really understanding her in a very psychologically realistic way, and then having her cross a threshold. To me, that form, I think, feels so interesting.
Yeah, it's incredibly exciting as a reader to see, like, you're kind of anticipating, like you mentioned, like what is she going to do with this obsession, and then you kind of see where it goes. It's always surprising. And I know Iris Murdoch, I haven't read her. Actually, I own The Sea and I haven't read it yet, but I've had a couple friends, like during the pandemic, I remember they've read it and they said like it's absolutely fantastic. And now that you mentioned it, I really want to read that book now. And I feel like she's one of those, I don't know how to define it, but like one of those book Twitter beloved like authors. People seem to love her on Twitter, and I always see her like recommended. So, and I know another like contemporary novelist that this book reminded me of was Atessa Moshfegh. She's currently like my favorite writer, and that sense of not, or anticipating what her characters are going to do, in a sense being unlikable, quote unquote. I don't really like that description, but just that suspense and anticipation was really, it reminded me of her work as well. And I think anyone watching this, if you like Atessa Moshfegh's work, I think you will vibe with this narrator and the interiority of it.
That's a great compliment.
Do you mind giving, so this is kind of a 3-part question, but do you mind giving a recent book that you've loved, anything that you're currently reading that you're enjoying, and then a book that you're looking forward to reading this year? So past, present, future.
Okay, great. Sure. Recently loved, the first book that comes to mind is Ghost Wall by Sarah Moss. She's an English writer. It's her first novel. Summer Water recently came out. That might have been something that might have been on your radar.
Yeah, I read that one. I really liked it.
Yeah. So Ghost Wall is so fantastic. And it's at the kind of book where you're reading it and then 80% through the book, or maybe even a little bit earlier, you start to realize that she's doing something completely different than what you thought. And it's very, very exciting. And it's a truly scary book. And I don't usually like scary books, but you feel it. You feel deeply unsettled while you're reading it. And I think and she's a wonderful writer. So I would definitely recommend that. I recently read that. I'm trying to think. I'm currently reading Crossroads right now, which I am not. I don't unrecommend, but I haven't finished it, so I have to see
Yeah.
more. Obviously, Jonathan Franzen is a big controversial figure for
Mhm.
people.
Yeah.
I recently finished The Past by Tessa Hadley, which is a older book of hers, but I think is a phenomenal book. I was just writing about it the other day. I think she has this really wonderful ability to make you feel really cozy and like you're reading just like a cozy book. And then it's also just, there's so much darkness and disturbance underneath in a way that appeals to me. So there's that. And then a book I'm looking forward to in the future. Well, I'll definitely read Pure Color by Sheila Heti. I'm looking forward to seeing what she's doing.
I'm glad that you mentioned Pure Color because honestly, one of the best books I think I've ever read. I had such an incredible reading experience reading that. I'd love to, hear your thoughts on it once you get to it. I think
Yeah.
Sheila Heti is just a master. And I also read Crossroads that you mentioned. One of my top 5 favorite books last year. I thought it was just really well done. I think he's an interesting figure. Not to get into Franzen discourse, but yeah,
Another
it was a
time.
really exciting book. Yeah, I know, right? Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Again, link to purchase the book is in the description below. It's one of the pains, I guess, and pleasures of reading an advanced copy is that you don't often have too many people to talk about it with. So I'm really eager to see the response to this book and dive into it further. So congratulations on the debut release. I'm very excited for you and for this book. I think it's going to get a big readership. I'm really excited about it. So congratulations.
Thanks so much, Jalen. Thanks for
Yeah,
having me on.
yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.